This show is brought to you in part by viewers like you who joined a Patreon or become YouTube members. Thank you. And if you could, hit the like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. All right, the latest episode of the in-season AFC North Hard Knocks has come out. It was an interesting episode. It definitely felt like a prequel to a bigger episode next week. And the way they set it up was kind of slick, because at first you're wondering, like, why did they pick and do it this way? And then you figure it out at the end. But spoiler warnings, if you haven't watched, go ahead and check it out. But I'm going to talk about what happened in the third episode of the in-season Hard Knocks for AFC North. So the way they set this episode up was interesting, right? Because they basically split the episode up into 4 15-minute chunks. And in those 15-minute chunks, we follow one player from every team and how they prepare for the week, how they recover for the week, and basically how they get their body and their mind right for playing a football game, right? So for the Steelers, they followed Russ. For the Browns, they followed Denzel Ward. For the Bengals, they followed Jamar Chase. For the Ravens, they followed Roquan Smith. And at first you're wondering why these 4 players, because the way they set it up, we're following the leaders of each team. And anybody who's been following the Browns knows that Denzel Ward is certainly a integral figure to the Cleveland Browns. He's not necessarily somebody that you think of immediately when you watch and cover this team every day about as like one of the main leaders of the team. Right, you usually look towards Myles Garrett for that. So I'm just like, okay, it's a weird choice to go with Denzel. Then you get to the end of the episode and you realize what this Hard Knocks crew was doing. And it was actually pretty slick. Because again, I said at the beginning of this video, this episode was kind of like a prequel to next week because there's a lot of AFC North action. So what they did in this episode was follow these 4 players because they're going to highlight how these players have to go against each other when they play each other in the AFC North next week. So it was purposeful that they chose Denzel Ward because they want to show Denzel Ward going up against Jamar Chase. And they want to kind of show you how that battle is going to go down. It was purposeful why they chose Roquan Smith, the leader of the defense, and they chose Russell Wilson, the presumptive leader of the Steelers offense, because they're going to showcase next week how they go against each other. How they come up with these storylines, these structures on the fly, edit it like this, is beyond me. This is fantastic work that the NFL Films crew has always been capable of. I imagine with 4 teams, 4 different camera crews, 4 different creative crews, this is very difficult to do. It includes a lot of sleepless nights. So, like, shout out to the NFL Films staff that works around the clock to come up with this, because that was a brilliant way to structure it. And it was a nice little reveal at the end on how they did it. Because, again, they were, like, framing it at the beginning. Oh, these are the leaders of the team. It's like, Jamar Chase ain't the leader of the Bengals. This is Joe Burrow, right? Like, why aren't you following Joe? Why aren't you following Miles? Oh, this is why, because you want to highlight matchups for next week's game. Brilliant way to frame the episode and kind of use this week where every team's not playing an AFC North team. And most of the games weren't very interesting. Honestly, all the games weren't very interesting. And use that to kind of build into what should be a pretty spectacular show next week. Good job by HBO. I got nothing but compliments for the structure of this story. It felt weird at first, but once they got to the end, I'm like, okay, it was great, actually, because it did get me pumped up for next week. Now, that being said, in this episode, for the Browns at least, what they focused on was Denzel Ward's story. If you don't know Denzel Ward's story, he has a fantastic one. Went to Nordonia High School, which is in Macedonia, which is about 20 minutes outside of Cleveland. It's like a suburb of the suburbs of Cleveland. Like it's like Cleveland, Akron area, but like I went to school in Cuyahoga County, Maple Heights. I knew a lot of people who went to school in Nordonia, right? So it is very much Cleveland. Denzel Ward's from there. he lost his father his freshman year in college. He's talking about how he got through all of that, and like kind of how his family got him through that, and how he processed that with anger, but now he doesn't process it with anger. He processes it with something else. And like during this whole thing, it made me really think about how underappreciated Denzel Ward is, given the level of player that he is. Because if you think about like the appreciation that we have for somebody like Joe Hayden, it doesn't feel like we appreciate Denzel Ward to that level, despite the fact that Denzel Ward, I think, has been a better corner than Joe Hayden has. Like Joe Hayden's high was like 2 seasons. Denzel Ward has been known as one of the best corners in the game since 2020. Like his peak has outlasted Joe Hayden's, and his peak was higher than what Joe Hayden's was. Like, he's played phenomenal football for this franchise. And I think he kind of has his appreciation. It takes a hit because he kind of exists in the shadow of Myles Garrett in his defense, because it just so happens that one of the better defensive players in his generation happens to play football for the Cleveland Browns, right? If this were, a lesser talented defense, Denzel Ward would be the face of it. But because you have Myles, it's always going to be Myles that's the face of this. It just makes me think how much we've taken Denzel Ward's greatness for granted, because he's been such a spectacular player. He's been so spectacular this year. And he's a great example of the kind of personality that I feel like the Browns are building their culture around, right? Or at least attempting to build their culture around. And I think that's one of the things that I want to get a really good grasp on during this in-season Hard Knocks, is while we're getting a little bit of a peek into that window in Berea, what is that culture in Cleveland? Like what kind of players and personalities thrive in Cleveland's culture? Because I was watching the Pittsburgh portion of this, and I was seeing how they react to Russ in Pittsburgh, and they seem to like legitimately like Russell Wilson. And the problem in Denver with Russ was that they didn't like him, right? And it makes me think of like Jerry Jeudy, who also wasn't liked in Denver and now has been successful with the Cleveland Browns. It seems like he's found a home there. And like with watching how Russ is received so much better in Pittsburgh, it kind of helped me understand Pittsburgh's culture and what players work and what things work there and what things don't. Because I feel, and this is my hunch on it, I feel like Russ works so much better in Pittsburgh with Mike Tomlin, because, and I don't mean this as an insult, I'm just saying this as a description, right? Like, so don't think I'm like trying to insult Mike Tomlin when I say this. But Russ and Mike Tomlin are similar because they're both very performative personalities and dramatic, right? Like positive guys, performative guys, dramatic guys. And if you really look at a lot of the players and the personalities that from the Mike Tomlin era of Pittsburgh Steelers football, that is persistent, right? Performative at times, dramatic at times. Like Russ does stuff in this episode where you hear him talking, you're like, I don't feel like that's actually how you go about it, right? Same thing goes with Mike Tomlin, where it's like it's too much, right? Like I feel like you're doing a bit much. Like I feel like you're performing for me right now. At least to my taste. Maybe I'm just off here, but it feels like there's like a level of performativeness that Mike Tomlin kind of gets with Russ, and they both kind of get each other, and they're a bit dramatic, both of them. And like, again, you look at these players that are successful there, they're very dramatic. The Steelers have always been pretty dramatic, right? Like pretty dramatic, pretty performative guys. I mean, TJ Watt, pretty dramatic, performative, like all that stuff. It kind of like is what they are. And like, again, performative can sound negative, but basically it's just like you put on more of a front emotionally, right? Like TJ Watt's always kicking down the door and screaming and beating his chest, right? He's always trying to show you how he feels, right? That's the same thing with Mike Tomlin. That's the same thing with Russell Wilson. That's what I mean by performative, right? I'm not saying that they're full of shit or anything like that. I know how you can get that impression. But it is kind of a performative energy in Pittsburgh. And that's interesting because the vibe I get from Cleveland is the exact opposite. Because while Pittsburgh is a bit dramatic, a bit performative, maybe sometimes over the top, the Browns are the exact opposite when they cut to these clips. The Browns, like by comparison, again, this is not an insult, are kind of cold, like really businesslike. They cut to Kevin before and after this game, like during the meeting. He's like, hey, you know what the problem is? It's not that we're not working hard. It's not that we're not running hard. It's not effort. It's that we're turning the ball over. We're making our lives harder, which is true. He's like, that's the problem. And then after the game, he said, hey, we worked our ass off, but the problem is we turned this ball over. Until we stop doing that, we ain't going to win no game, so we got to stop doing that. It's kind of a more cold, straightforward, business-like approach to a football team. There's really not much room for over-the-topness or performativeness or dramatics with the Cleveland Browns in that building. It's just get to work. And I feel like the guys who are more businessman-like, right? Like Amari Cooper was a great culture fit here in Cleveland. Amari Cooper's a businessman. Amari Cooper ain't got time to get super emotional. And the second that they felt like that he was getting a little emotional, they shipped him out of town. And then they put Jerry Jeudy in there, and Jerry Jeudy got to work, and now we all good. It's like a real factory business-like approach for the Cleveland Browns. It's a lot less dramatic. It's not very emotional. It feels like more of a, and again, this isn't a positive or negative thing. It's just a description. It feels like professional, like what you think of a professional place to be. It feels like a professional, almost corporate-like energy from Cleveland, where it's like, hey, bro, there's a job to do. You gonna do it or not? It's an interesting setup and an interesting contrast that you see between the two of them, right? And look, there's differences. Like I can't get a read on what Cincinnati is. We don't get much from Zach Taylor in this series at all. And then like John Harbaugh, he's so relaxed. It's hard to get a read on what's going on in Baltimore. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means I can't get a read of it. But yeah, that's kind of what my main takeaway was for the Cleveland Browns. I get here too that motivation is super tough. I think it's a good sign that the Browns were able to they're like these last few weeks, the Browns have been able to get their guys motivated to play really hard every weekend. And I think that's a good thing. I love the post-game speech I mentioned earlier from Kevin at the end of this one. I thought he spoke some real, right? He was straightforward and real about it. I appreciate that. I know sometimes we don't get that from his post-game press conferences, but those serve a different purpose than when he's talking to the team at the end of the game. And as much as I do like some of this stuff, I do think that you need a result. Like I need a result to make me feel better, right? I don't need the Browns to win a ton of games, but you know what? If they go out there on Sunday and they ruin the Bengals season and they can beat the Bengals while they're in playoff mode, still thinking they have a chance to make the playoffs if they win out, then you know what? I think I've seen enough this year to feel like there's something worth preserving there. So that's kind of my main takeaway. There was another one that I had here too, because they were going through everybody's prep, right? They went through Denzel Ward's prep strategy, Roquan Smith's prep strategy, Russell Wilson's prep strategy, and who else was there? Oh, Jamar Chase's prep, which he don't do much prep because they just showed him at a charity event, so he must not be doing a ton, which makes what he does amazing. But they went through the prep, and like you saw a bunch of like cold hot therapy. I think that's what Jamar Chase does. He does the cold tub, when the cryo tub kind of deal. But you saw like Russ and Roquan were really into the massages, right? And one, it makes you think about how much prep it takes just to get physically ready for an NFL game. At one point, Russ talks about how his first year, a vet told him he needs to get 3 massages a week to get ready to play football. And whenever you hear massage, you relate to it with the Browns. You have to ask yourself the question, like, I wonder how much Deshaun Watson's pre and post game routines, when it comes to his recovery, have dramatically been altered because of the allegations of sexual assault of massage therapists that he's had, has affected him in his ability to prepare here, right? Because he's not allowed to get massages. He's not allowed to do any of that unless it's like the team masseuse. And you look at these massages, like, it doesn't feel like it's the team's masseuse that's doing this for Russ or Roquan. I don't know. Roquan might have been a team masseuse, but I think everything else, Russ was especially not. And it makes me wonder, like, hey, was he ever able to find a process that was just as good as what he used to do? Obviously, the allegations are horrendous with Deshaun, and if what he needed to prepare for games is to assault women allegedly, then obviously it does not matter whether that's something that affected his play or not. I'm just making the point of, like, is this another piece to the puzzle on why that he looked like a completely different person once he got traded to Cleveland after these allegations? Like, it's not the whole thing. I'm not blaming his whole downfall on the fact that he's not allowed to get third-party massages anymore. I'm not even saying it's a sad thing that he's not able to. Like, if he has done what he's accused of, then I don't feel bad for him at all for not being able to have that privilege. I think that's the very, very least amount of punishment that he could get right there, right? But it does make you wonder, like, what else had to be altered when it comes to his ability to get ready for game day, and how much of an effect did that have, and how much of a role is that playing in just the rapid deterioration of his body over the last 3 years? You know what I mean? Like, it feels like it takes a lot to keep these guys up and running, even when they're healthy. Saw Denzel Ward have an IV in him. He was healthy, right? I've never had an IV in me and I was healthy. But it seems like it takes a lot to get these guys up and running. And I wonder just how much did his recovery take a hit from him and his actions, alleged actions, in the bans that he got because of that. You know, how much of that affected his ability to recover over the weekend? Is that a factor in why he's looked like that? Just something to think about, right? I'm not actually be sympathetic about it at all, but it's just something to think about. Like, hey, I wonder if that affected him, right? Is that another thing that added to this? And again, if you're the Browns, like, you got to ask yourself the question, like, should you have saw that coming, right? If you know that that's a big part of his recovery, he can't do that no more. Like, these things start to stack up. He hasn't played football. He's dealing with all this stuff and how people view him mentally. And then, like, his recovery process is the same. Like, you have to think about that. That, like, I don't know if Andrew Berry's going to be the GM after 2026, but, like, whoever is the GM for the Browns, they have to think about all of these things and like, try to never repeat this mistake again with the player or with a big name trade like this, because hindsight is 2020, but it just feels like there's so many ways that if we were a bit more vigilant, a bit more critical at the prospect, that we could have avoided making this mistake. But hey, that's hindsight for you, right? But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.